My own relationship with Maude Barlow began about 14 years ago when we joined a small group of activists as founding directors of the International Forum on Globalization, together with Vandana Shiva, Martin Kaur, Teddy Goldsmith, Helena Norberg Hodge, Tony Clark, Walden Bellow, John Kavanagh, and the rest of the gang. I know many of you know these people. I've been lucky to have worked with Maude ever since then to try and expose and resist the onrush of economic globalization, which once sold itself as a panacea for all the world's problems, but has lately been revealed as causing the greatest separation in history between the rich and poor, within countries and among countries, while also bringing the natural world to the brink of catastrophic breakdown. Over these years, Maude Barlow has without doubt been among the handful of most inspiring, beloved, and most importantly, effective leaders of that international resistance to this process, with many notable achievements, not the least of which was single-handedly, practically, bringing down the multilateral agreement on investment, which the fact that you may not have heard of it is one of the greatest achievements of all. While writing 16 books, this was going to be worse than the WTO and everything else. And she was the leader of that movement internationally. The last time we were together on a stage was 4 months ago in Washington, D.C., at a three-day IFG teach-in. The event was focused on what we call the global triple crisis, which is the global convergence of three advancing, very deadly conditions. The first, of course, is climate change, already affecting all regions of the earth. The second, less well noticed, the imminent end of the era of cheap energy, generally called peak oil. This in itself will threaten all operating assumptions of society and how we live in it. And third, the extensive global depletion of other key resources basic to human welfare: forests, fish and wildlife, arable soils, topsoils, coral reefs, life in the oceans, genetic diversity, with the expected extinction of up to 50% of all planetary species over the next half-century. Arguably the most important among these resources is fresh water, as it is the most basic necessity for all human life and is now suffering spectacular decline in supply and quality. Of course, that's the subject of Maude's great new book, and the main reason we're here tonight. At IFG, our gang has lately been arguing that all three of these issues are really the same, as all three are problems rooted in the same systemic circumstances and potentially reversed by the same set of systemic changes. The solutions to each are the solutions to all. As our colleague Teddy Goldsmith has been saying for decades, all we have to do is exactly the opposite of what we've been doing in every possible way. The causes of this situation are not mysterious. They're obvious, actually, rooted largely in the following 6 factors. 1, an economic system utterly dependent upon never-ending exponential economic growth and the race to dig up the growth for ever more natural resources to feed that growth. This despite the fact that on a finite planet, the very concept of never-ending growth is preposterous and more than a little crazy. 2, the global spread of commodity-oriented economic systems that promote consumerism as the primary means to individual happiness and fulfillment. 3, a half-century of reckless use of fossil fuels, fresh water, land, forests, etc., to fuel the above fantasy. 4, the destruction and domination of third world cultures that have traditionally offered sustainable alternative local economic models and practices, particularly indigenous and agricultural societies that have seen their lands and livelihoods destroyed for industrial purposes. 5, the profound systemic disrespect for planetary limits in terms of resource availabilities, waste generation, and consumption. And 6, finally, overpopulation, which exacerbates all the other pressures on the planet. This combination is bringing environmental and social crises on an unprecedented scale. Climate change threatens the world's most productive lands, physical upheavals from storms and rising waters, massive dislocations, desertification of agricultural lands, and economic and social tragedy far into the future, with problems particularly severe for the poorest nations and peoples. Peak oil, that is, the global decline of inexpensive oil and gas supplies, makes tenuous the long-term survival of industrial nations and industrialism itself at its present scale. Long-distance transport, industrial food systems, complex urban and suburban systems, and many commodities basic to our present way of life, autos, plastics, chemicals, pesticides, refrigeration, are all rooted in the basic assumption of ever-increasing, inexpensive energy supply. And the other resource shortages that I've mentioned, forests, agricultural lands, biodiversity, and again, water, make the long-term survival of humans and other species far more doubtful than at any time in our lifetime. As all of these crises advance, so do major geopolitical problems. We already see resource wars over oil, as in Iraq and Sudan. But as Maude has warned us since she first wrote Blue Gold, I think it was a decade ago, the next great wars may soon be over water, because even more than oil, which is a relative newcomer, sustainable life on Earth depends on a secure, long-term, never-ending supply of good fresh water. With every crisis comes great opportunity. These grim scenarios are only inevitable if we let them happen. We stand on the brink of catastrophe, but we all stand at the threshold of change. So far, however, governments, especially ours, are highly inadequate to deal, especially ours, are highly inadequate to deal with the scale of the problem. Efforts by corporations and industry remain largely enclosed by systemic necessities that require corporate economic growth and short-term profit be placed above all other standards of performance. The ideas and efforts of our politicians, including our dear presidential candidates, continue to skirt the realities of the need for real systemic change. I'm afraid that includes Mr. Obama. At IFG, we have lately created a new series of reports under the heading False Solutions. Our first is on biofuels. You can see it out on the desk out there. That is the conversion of vast areas of land and water to grow food to feed cars, not people. Then there's clean coal, an anomaly if ever one existed, but being heavily promoted right now. Clean nuclear, now receiving its semi-annual revival. Carbon trading and carbon offset schemes, most of which promote the misleading idea that nothing fundamental needs to be fixed about the values of the system or its priorities. And for water, desalinization. Maude will disabuse us of that tonight, I hope. Technology and market systems remain our gods and our salvation, and economic growth will somehow go on forever. And let's not forget another important part of the American response to the crisis, joining the green consumption bandwagon. Shop to save the planet is a kind of mantra right now. You can scarcely turn on TV without seeing all the latest innovations from power companies, car companies, chemical companies, all promoting terrific green products. Websites offer slogans like, "The more you shop, the greener it gets." Carbon offsets for every pair of jeans. Well, I don't think the ultimate solutions will come from greener products, but less products, recognizing the earth has limits and that we have to live within them and distribute scarce resources equitably. Conservation and localization, less and local. We cannot grow forever on a finite planet. The new pathways for the future are far more likely to focus on powering down, Richard Heidenberg's great phrase, using less energy, materials, resources, and water. Localization instead of globalization, abandoning the emphasis on export trade, giving up the idea of consumerism as the pathway to happiness, re-emphasizing community, equity, and sufficiency. I hope you've all seen Annie Leonard's fabulous video, The Story of Stuff. If you haven't, watch it on your computer tonight, The Story of Stuff. Resetting societies within value systems and pathways that accept the limits of the earth, which is a daunting task. But that, of course, is what Maude Barlow's life has been all about, and it's why we're so privileged to be with her here tonight. A year or so ago, I wrote an article about Maude just after she received the Right Livelihood Award, the Alternative Nobel Prize. As I finished, I asked her how she saw the future. Well, I guess the sensible thing to do is worry, she said. And she recited all the problems I just have recited, and many more. But on the other hand, she said, the world is rejecting globalization. She went on, we're transitioning eras right now, and I think it could be in a very positive direction. But in any case, hope is a moral imperative. We have no choice but to stay positive, keep fighting, and to have some fun doing it. Maude Barlow walks her talk. She's brilliant, brave, tough, visionary, and fun, too. Thanks, Maude, for coming all the way here to try to cheer us up and set us straight.
I've been tear-gassed with many fine people in this room, and it's a pleasure. So we're here to talk about water, and I'm not going to talk too long at you because I'd really rather talk with you and leave lots of time for us to chat. But I guess I want to kind of give a bit of a global picture if I can, and then kind of come back here to what we need to do in our own communities. The first thing I want to say is that I consider the global water crisis to be the greatest humanitarian or human rights and ecological crisis of our time. That's not to compete with climate change, but rather to say that the situation with water now is the first face of climate change. We are the statistics you could not exaggerate. There are close to 2 billion people living in water-stressed areas of the world. 1/3 of the people in the continent of Africa are now suffering from a lack of water. In 10 years, it will be 1/2 of the people living in Africa. The statistics are quite stunning. Every single day, more children die of waterborne disease than of HIV/AIDS, malaria, car accidents, and war put together. So we are dealing with a totally and completely preventable and largely political reality that people around the world who cannot pay for water are suffering and dying as we speak. Half the hospital beds in the world are filled with people who would not be there had they been able to afford clean water. So it is not only an ecological crisis, but a human rights crisis, and I do want to say it's very much a women's crisis. I've been hearing more and reading more and speaking more with women who are saying that it's also leading to an increase in violence against women again. When women are the primary ones responsible for finding water, they go out to seek it, they come back without it, and they get beaten. And I remember very clearly, it's just a powerful memory, standing on a hill in Cochabamba, Bolivia, being present at the first turning on of a tap of a public water source in this community, this very poor community, who had fought to kick Bechtel out, and suddenly finally had their water, and they were all dressed in their best outfits, and the men were all standing and giving speeches, and women were all sitting behind. And if you look down, there was a long, long hill and a little river, a polluted river, very, very far down the hill. And so the men gave their speeches. We drank chicha, which is this corn liquor. I remember that chicha. It didn't sit well with me and came out later in an airport, actually, in front of everybody. But anyway, they said to me, would you like to say something? And I said, I'd like to hear from one of the women. And one of the women elders got up and she started to moan and kind of cry and wail. And she said that every single year women hemorrhage to death going up that hill carrying these heavy bags of water on their backs. And that now with this public water that belonged to everybody and to which they had a right, this would no longer happen. So when you understand the life and death nature of this, it becomes very powerful. And Winona and I have worked in some of the poorest communities in the world. At the same time, we can't look at it just as a development or a human rights issue because there isn't enough clean water for everybody unless we stop polluting. And I can't say strongly enough to you that we are in an ecological crisis around water, and it is not just polluting of water. We're actually running out of potable water in the world. And the reason that's happening is that as we pollute our surface water, particularly in the global south, people no longer have access to the lakes and the rivers and the streams that they used to use for their livelihood and food production and so on. So what they're doing is turning to groundwater, and we're pumping groundwater faster than it can be replenished by nature everywhere in the world. India alone has 23 million bore wells going 24/7, which means that sometimes people will go to bed at night in a community or a valley or a farming area, and they'll have water, and then next morning they wake up and the entire valley is dry. And this is happening everywhere. It's happening in China as China uses its water and diverts its water not just from groundwater but from wilderness and from river systems and ecosystems to produce all of the goods that it's exporting all over the world. And again, whole communities wake up and the water is gone. We're also taking water from wilderness and sending it to great big megacities where if it's not returned back to the watershed, it's dumped in the ocean if they're anywhere near the oceans. We're also urbanizing, paving over wetlands and forests and the water retentive landscapes that are necessary in order for the hydrologic cycle to continue, and creating massive amounts of desert. China alone is creating a new area of desert the size of Rhode Island every single day. And finally, we're involved in something called virtual water trade, which is where you use your own water in a community or a country to produce something, usually food, and then you transport it out of the country, you export it. So you're not exactly exporting the actual water, but you're exporting a product that needed water to produce. And since we have, as Jerry said, still have this notion of unlimited growth, economic globalization, export-oriented competition, we don't stop and ask ourselves if that's feasible. And you should know that in your country, in the United States, you're now sending a third of the water out of the country every single day. Every single day, a third of your potable water is being sent away in the form of these exports. There are now 36 states that are in danger of serious to severe water crisis in this country. A number of them, of course, facing it right now. So these are really powerful questions. So what's happening is that we're laying pipelines around the world, much like the pipelines that now exist to carry oil and gas from one place to another, and we're moving water from where nature put it to where we want it, to water deserts, to grow food that's unsustainable, and of course very often the oasis that waters the desert in turn becomes a desert itself. And as strongly as I can say tonight to you, I want to say this: we are interrupting the hydrologic cycle, we are creating massive amounts of desert, and we have not place this equation into the analysis of climate change. The drying up of the surface of the earth from our displacement, mismanagement, pollution of water is the ground level equivalent of greenhouse gas emissions, which then of course trap the heat from above between them melting the glaciers. So we are not in a cyclical drought, and I have to say that as strongly as I can, particularly here in this part of the world. There are what the scientists call hot stains, places that are actually drying up. The Middle East, 22 countries in Africa, all of northern China, huge parts of India. These are countries that have water, some of them, some didn't to start with. Australia, the Mexican Valley, and of course the southwest of the United States, and now more and more we're seeing it on the eastern seaboard as well. And so if we get if we can get the analysis right about climate change, it's going to help us get the story right. So those are two crises that come together, but I would offer that there's a third. And the third is that as water becomes more precious, and we all learned back in grade 6 or whatever that the hydrologic cycle can't be interrupted, and where can the water go? As we're learning that's not true. What's happening is that large corporations have decided that this is the most precious commodity on earth. When I wrote Blue Gold 6 years ago, there were no indexes on the stock exchange where you could trade and buy water. It didn't exist. Now there are dozens of them. From every facet of life, every phase of a water drop's life, from when we take it out of the ground or river, an aquifer or whatever, to the cycle through the human use, through agricultural use, back through the hydrologic cycle, water is becoming owned and controlled by a corporate cartel. And I worry very much that as water becomes more precious, as the demand for it grows, as the population demand increases around the world, corporations are going to be able to make life and death decisions around who gets water and who doesn't. We know there are, of course, the big service utility companies like Suez and Veolia. The World Bank has forced these on the developing world. I mean, you try to imagine standing in a place called Orange Farm, which is a great big township in South Africa with about 1 million people in it. Poverty as far as you can see, rats in the gutter, no running water, people have pit latrines. Total poverty. But finally, because in the Constitution in South Africa they have the right to water, there are pipes coming up to each block, not really to each home or hovel, but to each block, and taps. But between the pipe and the tap is a water meter. And the only way you can get water from the water meter is to take your electronic key and go pay to get it charged up, and then you touch it to the electronic water meter, and then every single drop that you take is counted. And this is the way the world is denying or giving access to water to, depending on whether people can pay or not. As you know, I stood there watching this and watching the people go to the river that had cholera warning signs on it, I thought of the saying, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. It kind of gave new meaning to it. One of the lovely stories here, though, is that the South African municipal water workers who come in and have to install these during the day often come back in the evening after hours and show people how to break into them. So, I mean, there is great anarchy here. These corporations are also all over the global north and coming to a community near you as we cut back on funding for infrastructure and so on to local facilities and municipalities. These companies are circling around, and they're here in North America as well. And then we have bottled water, of course. Last year in the world, we put something like 50 billion gallons of water in plastic bottles around the world. It's growing at 10 to 15% a year. It's a form, in my opinion, of collective insanity to be putting that much water in chemical and fossil fuel containers that go out then and contaminate the water systems that are in decline. And on the whole, bottled water is not safer than tap water and is far less regulated, and it's one of the areas of corporate control that we really have to challenge. In this image of being in Pachimata, Kerala in India, with the women sitting across from the Coca-Cola factory who for 3 years sat in silent protest about the fact that Coke had gotten a contract to take the water out of the ground, build a great big armed fortress around this water system, and then proceed to take every drop of water from the local community. And the local community, tribal people, some of the poorest people in the world, fought back so hard that last year the Supreme Court of India shut Coca-Cola down. An absolute victory. I debated the international vice president of Coca-Cola here in Texas, actually, last year. And he was saying to me, you know, these people are just not willing to compromise. And I said, let me understand this. This is the people who have lived in this community for thousands of years. They have never polluted the water systems. They not only feed themselves, but they feed the local towns and villages around them. You come in, you take this plant, you shut them out with armed guards and dogs, you take their water, you destroy their livelihood, and you want them to compromise? The compromise is for you to go home. The compromise is for you to stop taking their water. But here's what we need to know. That is that Coca-Cola and these companies are fighting back with PR. They're putting money into building wells and digging ditches and so on in poor countries because they're trying to blue wash their behavior. But we need to be very vigilant about it. The latest form of water cartel is actually the big high-tech corporations, and I want to be very clear, I am for recycling. It is extraordinarily important that it is a piece of the puzzle and of the answer. But what I'm very concerned about is that corporations are circling this whole conservation, this whole water crisis, knowing that there is a huge amount of money to be made in dirty water. And what I see is, particularly with the American government spending billions of dollars in research, handing it over to these companies companies like General Electric, Dow Chemical, the nice folks who brought us Bhopal, want to sell you clean water. And I am very worried about their reliance on technology and the fact that then it's a total disincentive to protect source water. And I couldn't figure out why the UN Millennium Goals on water did not include water source protection and water conservation and water cleanup. And it seems to me very clear now it's because really it is all about a private solution for the global south. And we need to remember that our public water system in the north helped us build national economies and to make us more secure and wealthy. That is being denied to the global south, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's because they want the World Bank and the other institutions, the other banks and financial institutions imposing this, want actually to impose a colonial model on the global south. And getting control of their water services is absolutely essential. It's not just about making money, it is also, I believe, about maintaining control. So now we have 30-some desalination plants planned for California alone. The desalination plans for the world are to triple the number of desal plants in the next 10 years. There are 87 corporations building desal plants, and the latest is nuclear power desalination. So you're going to see the whole nuclear power fight start to come back because desalination uses a lot of fossil fuels and it's very expensive. It is a terrible technology. There are uses for desalination for brackish water and to support and protect source water, groundwater sources, but the big ones along the ocean that want to take out the water from the ocean, put it through their reverse osmosis with a chemical and then flush that brine and the chemical back out into the ocean. It's a poison. It's a poison process. It's a dirty, filthy technology, and we should be fighting it as hard as we can. And Winona will be telling you about the fight here. But we also have nanotechnology, again, totally deregulated, or I should say unregulated, and the move to build machines that take water from the clouds, water atmospheric generators, water generators they're called, and toilet to tap, the technology that says, well, we can export the best water away, but you're going to drink toilet water that's come directly from toilet to tap. I'm working with a group in Australia called CAD, Citizens Against Drinking Sewage. I mean, just to get really specific about what we're dealing with. So I just want to read to you my nightmare vision of what we're looking at. It's just 2 paragraphs from my book. If we don't change course. And I say here, imagine a world in 20 years in which no substantive progress has been made to provide basic water services in the third world, or to create laws to protect source water and force industry and industrial agriculture to stop polluting water systems, or to curb the mass movement of water by pipeline, tanker, and other diversions, which will have created huge new swaths of desert. So this is my image. Desalination plants will ring the world's oceans, many of them run by nuclear power. Corporate-controlled nanotechnology will clean up sewage water and sell it to private utilities, which will sell it back to us at a huge profit. The rich will drink only bottled water found in the few remaining uncontaminated parts of the world or sucked from clouds by corporate-controlled machines, while the poor will die in increasing numbers from lack of water. This is not science fiction. This is where the world is headed unless we change course, a moral and ecological imperative. Now, what we're calling for, and the work that we're doing with Food and Water Watch and my organization in Canada, and with what we call the Water Warriors, the global water justice movement around the world, is that we're basically calling for a halt to economic globalization, the Washington Consensus, market-based unregulated capitalism, unregulated non-stop free trade, and unlimited growth. We say the system is killing the planet. We have hit the biocapacity of the planet, and we've started to surpass it. And unless we curb our behavior and unless we change our ways here in the global north, there is absolutely no way we can convince, nor should we be able to, anyone in the global south to join us in a fight to save the world's carrying biocapacity. And this is particularly true for water. So we're calling for a blue covenant, hence the title. And this covenant basically has 3 parts. The first part is a covenant from us to the earth. And the most important things that we can do is stop polluting, is to have strict laws against anyone polluting, any industry, any industrial agricultural pollution of our water systems. Source protection is so important. And if we mean it, we pass laws and we abide by them. And we consider it a crime against the future and a crime against future generations to allow people today to pollute water for tomorrow. Martin Luther King said legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless. And we have to restrain the heartless among us. And there are people out there, and you go on the websites of some of these corporations, they say there's a water crisis, and boy, is there money to be made from this water crisis. Conservation and equity, which are the fundamental underpinnings of a water-secure future, are not they're not the principles upon which you build a water-secure future if you're a corporation, not the way you build a profit if you're a large corporation. You have to take advantage of the crisis, and they are. So we're calling also for an end to this overpumping of our groundwater. There are bore wells going into the Great Lakes that go as deep under the ground as Chicago skyscrapers go up into the air, and they are sucking the water from Lake Michigan, for instance, so hard, and this is supposed to be for the water sources that feed Lake Michigan, that they have actually reversed the flow of water in Lake Michigan for the first time. And this is why the Great Lakes, like most lakes around us in the world, are declining. Every single one of the 677 lakes in Africa are in crisis and in radical decline. Winona and I last week launched a campaign to try to save Lake Naivasha, which is the beautiful lake where Out of Africa was filmed, in Kenya, which of course is going through this terrible internal civil strife now. And Lake Naivasha is a gorgeous lake in the Rift Valley, the site of the last great hippopotamus herd in East Africa. And it is being destroyed, will be a, quote, putrid puddle in 5 to 10 years, in the words of a group of scientists, because European flower farms have surrounded Lake Naivasha, and they're pumping the water to grow roses so that Europe doesn't have to use its water to grow roses. And if you go to our website, foodandwaterwatch.org, you'll find our report and our plea that we save this lake. But of course, it's one lake among many around the world that we're pumping dry. So this is a behavior that has to stop. And we have to reintroduce the rain. We have to bring back water retentive landscapes. And this could be a wonderful project in terms of labor-intensive work for many, many people. It's not a high technology solution, and I'm not saying there's no place for high technology, but my worry is, at the moment, that the Bush administration in this country and the European countries are the same, and in China it's the same, that the major centers of power are looking towards high technology, what Jerry calls the false solutions of high technology, instead of the soft path of conservation, infrastructure repair, protection of our environment, and having some humility and remembering that we are just a species like every other species, and we better learn to live within nature's dictates. We have this notion in the global north that if we run out of something, it's okay because we can import it, or some technological fix is out there somewhere. If the cod crash off the east coast of Canada, well, what the heck, there's sea bass off Chile. Oops, the sea bass off Chile are gone, but they've discovered something a little deeper. We have this notion, and we have become unhumble. We lack humility as a species, particularly in the global north, and have to find it again. And if we don't find it, water is going to teach us a lesson that we should not have to learn, because it's going to be a place, it's going to be a situation where there won't be anywhere to go to get away from the global water crisis. We're also then calling for a blue covenant, however, with the poor. And that is not a notion of charity, and there are lots of people who go and help build wells and try to find ways to alleviate the crisis in the global south now, but we need justice, not charity, in the global south. We need to realign the international geopolitical relationship between the global south and the global north. Right now, the countries of the global south send more money north in debt repayment than we send south in aid and trade alone. And so countries don't have the money to implement decent water structures or education or healthcare or anything else for their people. And we have to understand that we have, in effect, lived off not only the land and the water and the resources of the planet, but we are also now living off the land and water and resources of the third world. And this is particularly true for industrial biofuels, which use a huge amount of water, waste and abuse. There are plans for this state, for California, for biofuels and being subsidized by the government here, for which you simply don't have water. It's about a third of the flow of the Colorado River every single year. It would be needed to fulfill the plans for biofuels here. It is simply not sustainable. And finally, we're talking about a commitment, a covenant to democracy, and a covenant to justice in terms of this must be a public commons, that we have to stop seeing water as a commodity and see it as a commons that belongs to us all. And we're working very hard at the United Nations to get a UN covenant on the right to water. We want it to recognize the Earth's right to water, or as a scientist friend of mine says, we have to recognize the right of a drop of water to domicile, which really took a long time for me to get my head around. But we need to start respecting nature for its own self, and not just in terms of what it does for us or its service to us. We have to see and protect the right of nature to existence and to health, to watershed health. It's absolutely key. And I'm very excited about this work at the United Nations, because what's happened is that the concept of the right to water has started to percolate down into many, many countries and communities. Uruguay 3 years ago became the first country in the world to actually hold a plebiscite to get a referendum on their national ballot to force a constitutional amendment that water is a fundamental human right. And you'd think that's a motherhood, right? There were a lot of people who were told to vote against it. It was very controversial. And this is where our global justice movement came in. A number of us went to Uruguay. I went several times the week just before the big vote, and I said the whole world's watching because this matters. We took out big full-page ads showing that hundreds of groups around the world were watching and cared that this mattered. And in fact, they won, and the Constitution had to be amended. And the constitutional amendment actually said that water is has not only a human right, but a public service. It must be delivered on a not-for-profit basis. And the corporations had to leave. Very unhappy, you could imagine. But you can bring it right closer to home. There's a little town called Barnstead, New Hampshire, and it's one of those, if you blink, you miss it, right? It's right across the border from Maine, from Freiburg, Maine, and there have been huge fights there with Nestle because Poland Springs, which is one of the Nestle companies, yes, right, has been stealing the water, has been taking huge amounts of water. You just stand on the highway and you watch these big trucks rumble by with their great big water, just taking huge amounts of water out. And the people in Freiburg have been fighting back really hard. In fact, the man who leads the fight in Freiburg is an 88-year-old former Republican businessman who moved there and created great jobs. He has a manufacturing base, and he situated himself and his family on a lake which is being destroyed because all the water that feeds the lake, the groundwater and so on, is being pumped away by Nestle. And he's become radicalized. It's very, very funny to meet him, as he said to me, because he always had the doors to the governor open when he was, a right-winger and a big businessman and gave lots of money. The doors open, but now he's really upset, and he sent them in a package some sludge, this algae that's been growing from his lake, and the police came to inquire about, was he a terrorist? And so he's really gone through this radical transformation, and he says to me, Maude, he says, do you know that corporations have a lot of power with governments? And I said, I'd heard this. It was just really quite sweet to what. And he said, do you know that the World Bank is forcing the poor countries to take water privatization, and these corporations are all over the third world? And I said, I'd heard that too, and it was just to watch this, so that I wouldn't want to be up against this man. I put him against Poland Springs that he's going to win, but right next door across the border is this Barnstead. And the good folk of Barnstead, when Poland Springs came nosing around and saying, you've got nice clean water, we want your water, they said no, and they went to their state legislators who said, we can't do anything because Poland Springs is so powerful. And they went to their municipal councilors and they said they can't do anything, so they all got together in a barn. And they unanimously passed the the Barnstead resolution that basically says that the water in their community belongs to the earth in their community, it belongs to them, it belongs to future generations, and that Poland Springs and every other corporation is not welcome to take it, and they all signed it, the Barnstead Ordinance. And Poland Springs has left them alone. Now, is that legal, this ordinance? I don't know. What's very exciting what's happening when people come together in communities in New Hampshire, a group called SOG, Save Our Groundwater, who's been fighting a big corporation from Europe that's in taking their water, has managed to actually get legislation on, to be voted on, but we think it's going to pass quite soon, that actually says if groundwater is going to be considered to be allowed to be leased or traded to a private company, they have to put it to a democratic vote of the people. So this kind of democracy is breaking out all over the world, and it is a fabulous thing. And I think the reason that it is breaking out around water so much is because water is life. You can't live without it. I mean, I spoke to one man said to me in Bolivia, this is a different fight, in La Paz, where they've kicked Suez out. The government has told them to leave, but they brought Suez in, and Suez said that it would bring in all these, this tertiary, really good set of wastewater treatment systems, and they didn't. All they did was just build these channels, these ditches. And they just poured the garbage and the sewage, and I stood by one when I was there 2 years ago, down from an abattoir where just the animal parts were coming out. You cannot imagine, all just being dumped into Lake Titicaca, which is a World Heritage Site, but is not going to be much longer. And they told me that the week before a child had fallen in by accident and of course died. I mean, we are really truly talking life and death here. And this was a broken promise by this corporation. I had a British camera crew with me, and I said, up until now, I was so upset. I said, up until now, I've been accusing this company of theft of this water, but I think that now I want to accuse them of murder. And the guy put the camera down. He said, do you want to rephrase that? And I said, only if you can think of a stronger word, because I can't, right? So what we have is a situation where people have no choice but to stand up and fight. And one of the leaders in this movement, in this particular community, said, you know what, you may as well put a bullet in my head as make me die of that stuff in there, or watch my children die that way. And so the global water justice movement has become a gift to all of us, not just to those of us in the water movement, but it's become a gift to us in that the courage and the ingenuity. I mean, the folks in Uruguay put that plebiscite where they had to get almost 2/3, I think it was 60%, of all the people who lived in Uruguay to sign this plebiscite and put their fingerprint, and they checked to see if there were any doubles, because if they found any doubles, they threw the whole thing out. They did all of this until we got involved on one computer held together by duct tape, And we helped them get some more computers and with just some bit of a transfer of resources in order to make this happen. But it is so moving to watch the respect of the North and the South together, that it's not us teaching that, but rather that we all together are trying to learn how to live within nature's laws, how to share equitably in a world of increasing demand and diminishing supplies, and the wonderful ingenuity that takes. And it's been a privilege, a rare and wonderful privilege to work in this. I just want to end by saying that what I see really two kind of futures here. As Woody Allen would say, two paths. One leads to total and utter destruction, and the other to the end of everything. and then he says, may we have the courage to choose wisely. But there really are two choices. One choice, which is where we're going now, with some exceptions, is conflict. It's major conflict. There's geopolitical conflict. China, I keep going back to China because it's such a stunning story. They've got a lot of water. They've got as much water as we have in Canada. But what they've done is they've transferred that water to their, production of all the toys in the world and so on. So they've built a pipeline, or they are building a massive pipeline to take the water from the Tibetan Himalayas and divert it to China. Now that water in the Tibetan Himalayas feeds the 5 major rivers of Asia. I mean, you want to talk about a coming war? You think about China helping itself to the water that belongs to the rest of the continent. So the potential, and I've also wrote about here how water as a national security issue has gone to the top of the Bush agenda. 6 years ago when I wrote Blue Gold, there was none of this. But now there's a consortium that's advising the Bush administration and the Pentagon, and it includes all these right-wing think tanks and some companies like Coca-Cola, of course, and Lockheed Martin. So it's very interesting how the kind of security, military, blanket kind of starts to cover this concern of whether water. It's becoming like energy, a geopolitical resource, and there's going to be struggle over it. There are also going to be continued struggles, growing struggles between rich and poor. You go to countries where people don't have water in one community, and across the river, there's all the water for the golf courses and the shopping malls and everything else that people need or people can access if they have the money. And so this is becoming one of those issues of the Great Divide. There's nothing kind of quite like seeing someone die of water to make you understand or make one understand that not having money is literally it's the Great Divide. In terms of who will live and who will die. There's conflict between rural communities, wilderness, nature, indigenous peoples, and megacities. I mean, we have these huge megacities growing very often because farmers and other people displaced from the land move off the land and come in as the new poor in these urban centers. And in Mexico City's run out of water. So what they've done is they built these pipelines. One of them goes into the heart of an indigenous community of a people called the Bazaos. And they put this fortress, think water, think fortresses. They confiscated the water source, built a great big fortress with armed guards and barbed wire and dogs. I've been there. And to see the indigenous women there in their outfits, their skirts, and holding these pretend rifles, their little wooden carved rifles, standing out there. They call themselves commandant. They got their Commandante Maria and so on, and standing guard out there just to show resistance, although the resistance is them just standing there. That's the resistance. Although recently some of them have been actually taking sharp objects to the pipeline that takes the water from their community to Mexico. And so we see that kind of fighting. Farmers in a valley in Klamath in Indonesia get up in the morning and they meet each other with machetes and knives to see who can get the little bit of water that has been collecting in the cisterns and so on. They literally fight each other for the water. And this is an old story, isn't it? Instead of fighting power, we fight each other. And we're also going to find, I think, struggles between people and nature. And we are already, as a human species, taking way more than our share of the natural world and what water has given to us. So that's one scenario, and it's happening now. But there is another scenario that is also happening now, and that is where people are coming together and saying, if we can just figure out this thing around water, if we can just figure out how this can be, perhaps water can become nature's gift to us to teach us how to live in harmony with one another and in peace with the earth. I think of the group called Friends of the Earth Middle East, and this is a group of people who come from all of the different warring factions, and they're sitting down and they're talking about sharing the water resources there. And just that, not history, not politics, nothing else, just how could we together protect the water sources? How could we together implement some kind of equitable solution to the water crisis here? And of course, the water crisis is at the heart of so many issues. So this dream of mine that water will become the teacher, nature's gift to us to teach us how to do this better, is a real one. And if we can build on this global water justice movement, and if we can have a set of principles that say that nobody owns water, that it belongs to the earth and it belongs to all species and it belongs to future generations, and no one has the right to claim it for profit, and no one must be denied it because they cannot pay. If we could agree on those principles, on those fundamental principles, and that the earth has rights and other species have rights, we would build lifestyles and we would build laws that would make a more sustainable world and a more sustainable future. So I'm just going to end with my favorite quote. This is from Tolkien. It's Gandalf, who is facing an evening with the terrible war coming and perhaps the destruction of everything that he has, that is life and life affirming on his earth. And so how he girds himself with these words. And I share them with you because I expect that I'm in a room full of what I call stewards, people who are fighting for public health, for public education, for sustainable food systems, for a sustainable lifestyle, for democracy. And so he says this, and I just want to end the formal part with these words. He says, "The rule of no realm is mine, but all worthy things that are in peril as the world now stands, those are my care. And for my part, I shall not wholly fail of my task, if anything passes through this night that can still grow fair or bear fruit and flower again in the days to come. For I too am a steward. Did you not know?" Thank you very much. What we have done in the Global South, of course, is a crime in many cases, and they are mostly our corporations, although sometimes they're their corporations as well. I think that's part of the story of China that we need to recognize, is that we say China is doing this. Well, actually, it's Walmart and other corporations that mostly come from our part of the world that are doing that damage that happens to be on Chinese soil, and I think we have to be very, very clear. We're in a work at the International Forum on Globalization, we have recommended, in other places, we've recommended that our corporations should be held accountable for their behavior in other countries as if they were operating in our own. And what happens is we have laws here in our own countries, and those companies have to obey them. But when they go to other places where either there aren't laws or they're ignored, they're able to act in another way. And I think that needs to change. We have to make it so that those corporations are accountable. In my country, it's the mining companies. Canadian mining companies are among the most terrible corporations in the world. They are polluting around the world. I'm just mortified when I go on my travels into the Global South and people tell me about yet another Canadian mining company that's destroying the water table or has removed livelihoods and so on. I got into a big dust-up with the big one, Barrick Gold in Canada, and I mean, they threatened us, they threatened Amnesty International with a lawsuit. I mean, these are really big, powerful companies, and you just, one treads, but one treads knowing that you're up against this kind of power. And we have, I go back, I think I quoted Martin Luther King, legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless. We absolutely need laws around the behavior of our corporations around the world. And this is the story of Bali, with the Global South saying, what are you asking for us? As our friend Martin Core makes a point that what's a cutback for a man who's 250 pounds, it might not hurt him to cut, as opposed to a man who's 80 pounds. There's nothing to cut. Are we going to cut 50? You're going to cut 50, you're going to die. And that equity, that notion of equity is much closer than it ever used to be, because it really is, as William Grider said, one world, ready or not. And nothing shows that like water, because it's just one system, right? So yeah, we have a lot of answering to do, but that's happening, I think, a great deal with this movement of ours. I'm really worried that private companies are going to claim water in all sorts of ways. Rainwater catchment is one of them. Recycling is another. I mean, if General Electric is recycling dirty water, is it going to claim that it owns that water? I mean, Coca-Cola now claims, and it successfully claims, that it owns the water it sells. So are we going to see this as our collective water that is being, for which a private corporation is given a contract to clean, but it still belongs to us? Or are they going to be able to claim that it's private? And the same with rainwater catchment. It really worries me. And you talk about rainwater catchment. When Bechtel was given the contract in Cochabamba, Bolivia, the first thing they did was raise the rates, triple the rates of water, which brought people to the streets. The second thing they did was tell them they were going to charge them for the rain they caught on the cisterns on their roofs, you know? So the water that people captured for their own use had to be paid for. The company actually said, we will calculate how much it is and you owe us that, because we now own the water, even the water that comes down in the form of rain. So it's, you know, it has a precedent that, and which is why we need to start asking ourselves what kind of regulatory systems we need. I got an email from a scientist who works with the Environmental Protection Agency here in California who read my book and said, you are right. Between George Bush at the federal level and Schwarzenegger at the state level, we are deregulating. They are succeeding in getting the wastewater treatment system, deregulated. And he said, we're putting dangerous so-called regulated or cleaned up water back into the system, and he was really concerned about it. So I do, and I have a quote in the book where this guy, one of the big water companies, says, we want to do for water what we did to telecommunications in the 1990s. We want it completely deregulated. So it's, you know, there's money to be made, and it's already happening with nanotechnology. There's millions, billions of dollars being put into nanotechnology experimentation with water. And again, it's just not regulated at all. So it's, I think that the question is, this question of what is the proper role for the private sector and how do we maintain public oversight is an extraordinarily important one, and it has to be articulated in the laws that we pass. I think within every community this is happening now. We have to see it not as us against them, but how we're going to do this together. It's awareness. I was in Utah for the Sundance Film Festival last month, and Utah, I mean, it is totally dependent on the snowmelt from the Rockies, and they're cutting down the trees and the shrubs from the hills as fast as they can, and the trees and the shrubs are what holds the snow, and that's what maintains the integrity of the water system. They're building new, ski runs and ski resorts and so on. I was telling Winona that the shower went from, in my ticky-tacky little condo, went from off to hurt, like it was, there was no kind of in between, and it's that awareness that has to permeate our lives so that every single thing we do is measured against its impact on water. We're absolutely going to have to get there. In terms of water, we share a border with the United States, and we're very concerned collectively around the shared boundary waters, particularly around the Great Lakes. We're losing, we use every day out of the lakes, keep trying to convert from liters to gallons. About 1 trillion gallons of water are taken out of the Great Lakes every day, and nature does not put 1 trillion gallons back in, and those lakes are steadily declining. So we have a lot of issues together. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about Canada's water and how to find ways to get Canada's water down to the thirsty parts of this country. And I just want to say one thing about that, and that is that I think we need to stop thinking about it as nation states, and this is Canada's water, and we will or won't share it with you. This is water that belongs to ecosystems, and the way it operates right now, we have about 90% of Canadians living along the Canada-US border. We don't have access to that water either. We're running out in many parts of the country. We're absolutely destroying our water table in northern Alberta to produce the heavy oil to send to the United States. Under our agreement under NAFTA, by the way, we signed something called proportional sharing, and we are required to continue to send our oil to the US, even though we're now running out of conventional oil and gas. So we're now having to go to this heavy oil in the tar sands, which is huge. It's got enough heavy oil to pave a road, a 4-lane highway to the moon with off-ramps. But the problem is that you have to steam blast it out with water, and we're destroying the entire water system of the Athabasca Basin. So we have crises in our own country. Where we do have water is in the far north, and it flows into the north. And to get at that water, either for us who live along the border or for you here, we would have to take that water, reverse the flow from Hudson's Bay, move that water through massive pipelines, probably fueled by nuclear power, to move that water down, and it would kill the north. The oil exploration and diamond exploration and everything that's happening there already would. So I want to put a plea to us not to see this as nation-state water that we will or won't share, but rather to see it as ecosystem water, that we're all going to have to take more care of the water that we use where we live so that we don't destroy the north, which does not belong to Canada, which belongs to the Indigenous people, the people who live there, and its own ecosystem that depends on it. Just a piece of advice that I lovingly share with you, that is shared with me by a 95-year-old friend of mine. Whenever any of us get kind of feeling down and we think that there's too much work and it's never over, she says, "Oh, you young people," and she says, by that I mean anybody under 90, so of course everybody loves her, right? So, and her advice, and she's been involved in every fight, from the fight for women and every social justice fight, every environmental justice fight, from when she was a young person to now, and she never gave up. And she said, "Let me just tell you that fighting for environmental or social justice is not like a fad or a fashion that you can just decide one day you're going to do or not." She said, it's something you commit to, you take on. And she gets all frustrated, and then she says, "It's like taking a bath. You do it every day or you start to stink. So don't stink." Thank you so much.